Hey everybody, it's John here with the Cloud Bureau, and today we have a video on communicating from parent to child Lightning Web Components in Salesforce. So basically the situation is you have a component that instantiates another component. So you have a parent component and nested within it is another component. That's called component composition. And we want to talk today about how to communicate from the encompassing component or the parent component to the child component. I'm going to show you a range of ways to do that, and then we're going to talk about why there's a specific way to manage parent-to-child communication that is preferred from a Lightning Web Components perspective. So with that, let's get into it. I'm logged into a developer edition org, and I'm on the home page. And I have a component set up here, and you'll see that it sort of shows you which component is the parent component. So this is the encompassing white box, and which component is the child component. The idea is pretty simple here in that if we were to put a value into one of these fields, it would update the value on the child component. So just to show you what that looks like, I will put get here, and you'll see that get gets populated here. This second one has an initial value specified, and it's actually hard-coded on the component, which we'll see in a moment, but if I were to change it here, it will change as well. And you see that update. And for indirect, it populates, and then for method, it populates. Now, the issue is how is it doing that? And in each case, it's doing it in a different method. In one case, the parent is calling the setter on the child component for the variable that shows up here. In one case, the value is being passed through the child component sort of binding to the component directly. In one case, we're setting we're sort of using a query selector on the parent component to get an API decorated value on the child and setting it that way. And in the last case, the parent is calling a public method on the child component and setting the method that way. I'm going to open my developer console and clear this out because we'll come back and look at this in a minute. But let's go take a look at the JavaScript, and we will go one by one. Here's an SFDX project that has these two components defined, the child component and the parent component. I want to look at the child component first, and we're looking at the JavaScript file. You can see that the JavaScript file is pretty simple. We have imported the Lightning element, which is standard when you instantiate a Lightning Web Component using SFDX, and we've added the API module to that import. That is so that we can decorate various things with the API decorator, which essentially makes them public properties. If you've watched some of our other videos, you know that you can use those, for example, to then define properties in the XML file, the metadata file for the Lightning Web Component to be able to expose them in things like Lightning app builders and flows. But here we're talking about the direct sort of communication between two components, a composing component or a parent component and a child component. So we have an API decorated property called direct API value. We have an API decorated getter and setter, which is basically returning or setting a private class attribute here. So this is a private class attribute, so is this, but there's a convention where if the private class variable is managed by a getter and setter, you sort of begin it with an underscore. So I've used that convention here. For the third example, via public property, we have an API decorated property simply called indirect API value. And then for the last one, we have a private method or private class variable called method value. And then we have a publicly decorated or publicly available method that a parent component can call to set the value of this private class variable. Let's take a quick look at sort of just the HTML for this. You'll see that I'm just showing you a list of values and telling you which one it is, and they have their corresponding bindings to the various variables that we saw here. So direct API value, this get set value, indirect API value, and then this method value. Okay, let's take these one by one in turn, and I want to start with the getter setter value. If we go to the parent component and we look at this component, basically the way that it works is the input fields that are defined on the HTML template, which are here, so setter, direct, indirect, method, are all wired to this handle input change method. The handle input change method sort of receives the event when that changes, keeps track of the context, and basically what it's grabbing is the name here so that we know which thing we want to do. And then it's doing a debounced function to wait and allow the person time to type before it actually manages the thing that we want it to manage. If we look in our timeout function that we've passed in, we have a switch statement that's switching on that context. So it's switching on sort of the name property of these lightning inputs. And then it's doing something. So it's calling one of 4 methods, which are defined down here. In the case of the getter setter, which is our first example, we see that when it's a setter change, so when that input changes, and after the timeout has fired, we are going to call this doSetter method. So we're calling this method here, and we're passing it the value, the new value that's been put into that input field. You can see here that what we're doing is we're calling this template query selector. So we're doing a query selector on this parent template, but what we're getting is actually the embedded child component, which is here. So we're calling this thing. That's what we're retrieving with our query selector. When I do that, I have access to the publicly decorated things, whether those are attributes or methods, on the child component. And you'll see here in the get set, what I'm doing is getting that. I'm getting that get set value, which is on this child component, and setting it equal to the value. What's happening is that when I populate this, it's calling the setter method on the child component for this get set value and putting in the value of sample. So the parent can call a setter method as long as it's publicly decorated on the child to set an attribute that way. In the second example, we're using direct communication using the template itself. If we go look at the parent component, you'll see that we have defined the direct API value with the direct API value specified on the parent. If we look at that here on the parent, we see that attribute, and we see it's hard-coded as initial value, which is why that shows up when our component initializes. It's then passing it using this to the child component. Now, on the child component, the name is direct API value, but in Lightning Web Components, when we're passing information this way, we essentially take the camel cased value and we separate the camel casings by dashes, and everything is lowercase, and then we're setting it equal to the bound attribute on the parent component. When it initializes, that's available as of the connected callback. So when the component is connected to the DOM, this value on the child is available from this API. And so it's showing up as initial value. However, in the parent component, when the direct input is changed, we're calling a method called doDirect, and again, we're just passing it the value that's been placed into that input. And down here, you can see that this direct API value is equal to value. Now, what's happening here is that we're actually setting this value to a different value, so whatever the new update value is. And because that's bound in our template here, it's passing it down to the child component here. Spoiler alert, this is the recommended way of passing information from a parent to a child component. And the basic reason for that is that if you have variables that are declared in both places and you're passing value, you want one component to be sort of the source of record or source of truth for this value. And so you wouldn't want to manipulate this value directly in this component. You would want always pass that information back to the parent and have the parent update it so that it comes through that template binding. And we'll show that in a subsequent video, how that works. For our third example, for indirect, you can see that we're doing indirect. So when the input field for the indirect, the input with the name indirect is updated and we've debounced, we call this doIndirect and passing it the event detail value. That's down here. And here you can see, just like with the setter, we're actually using the query selector to get that child component. And because the indirect API value is declared as a public property on the child, we can set it directly here by getting that query selector. The last one is method, and this one's a little bit different in the sense that remember that on the child component, the method value is private, so we can't get access to it directly from the parent, but we have a public method defined that allows us to manipulate this value from the parent. So we'll go to the parent, we'll look at the case of method, and we have this do method or do method method established, and we pass it the event detail value. Down here you can see that it's also doing the query selector, but it's getting the method, so that's set method value and passing it the value. And on the child component, what's happening is this method value is being set to value. Now, all four of these will work. All four will allow a parent component to set public properties or private properties that are accessible via some other public method on the child component. But again, the recommended way is to do it via template binding so that the parent is always the source and record and truth. But this shows you a little bit about how the API import works and how we use the API decorator to define both public properties, public getters and setters, and public methods so that we can access those from the parent component. If you are struggling with how to get information between components in your Lightning Web components using APIs and public properties and public methods, we're always happy to help here at the Cloud Bureau, so please feel welcome to reach out.